Ancient empires were built on lies whispered along dusty trade routes. The most valuable goods in history, from spices to silk, arrived wrapped in fantastical stories designed to hide the truth and multiply their worth. This video uncovers the 26 core deceptions that merchants and empires use to control the world. You will learn exactly how deliberate falsehoods shaped our global economy and see their direct echoes in the markets of today. We will explore why pepper was said to grow in forests guarded by serpents, and how entire voyages were launched based on maps filled with imaginary monsters. By the end, you will never look at the price of anything the same way again. What do you believe is the most powerful lie ever sold? A Roman merchant leans across a market stall, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper as he describes the perilous journey of pepper. He tells of dense, sweltering forests in a land so distant the sun itself seems to die each night, where the precious peppercorns grow like tiny jewels on vines guarded by enormous, venomous serpents. Harvesting it, he claims, requires setting the entire forest ablaze, driving the serpents into a frenzy just to collect the blackened spices from the ashes. This story was not just a colorful tale, it was a necessary lie, a calculated fiction designed to explain why a handful of these dried berries cost as much as a soldier's monthly wages. In the ancient world, trade was not merely an exchange of goods. It was a sophisticated theater of misinformation where the truth itself was a commodity to be carefully managed and manipulated. Historians like Peter Frankopan have shown that for these early merchants, secrecy and wild exaggeration were tools as vital as any ship or camel caravan. They weaponized the vast geographic ignorance of their customers. Most people in Rome would never see India, so how could they dispute a story of fire and serpents? This was not simple fraud, it was a strategic system. By weaving supernatural claims and tales of impossible danger around their goods, traders created an effective monopoly on information. Buyers, with no other sources to consult, had no choice but to believe the unbelievable. This systemic deception artificially inflated demand and justified staggering prices, laying the very foundations of entire economies that thrived on controlled narratives. It makes you wonder, what other truths do we accept today simply because the story behind them is the only one we have ever been told? A Phoenician merchant would spin a tale of silk plucked directly from the leaves of a mythical tree, a story so enchanting it completely masked the truth of patient silkworms and secret Chinese workshops. This was the first great deception, the deliberate mystification of a product's origin. The goal was simple and ruthless. If your customers, or worse, your competitors, did not know where a luxury truly came from, they could never cut you out of the deal. They could never sail directly to the source. Ancient writers like Herodotus became unwitting conduits for these trade lies, recording as fact that cinnamon was harvested from the immense, precarious nests of giant birds, and that certain gems held the power to ward off evil spirits. By weaving these fables, merchants did more than just protect a route. They built an aura of unattainable magic around their goods. Consider the frankincense and myrrh that flowed from the deserts of Arabia. Its value was inflated by stories of lands guarded by vengeful spirits and journeys that required divine favor to survive. This narrative of inherent peril and scarcity meant that only a select few, those in on the secret, could control the flow of wealth. The line between reality and myth was intentionally blurred, transforming simple commodities into objects of legend and allowing a handful of clever traders to shape the entire world's perception of distant, unknowable lands. If you could control the story of where something came from, you held the ultimate power over its price. These whispered stories of mythical origins were powerfully reinforced by a second, equally potent deception: the deliberate exaggeration of danger. If you could not hide the general direction of a trade route, you could make the journey itself sound so terrifying that no one else would dare attempt it. Picture the maps of the age of exploration, their margins filled with illustrations of sea serpents coiling around ships and whirlpools large enough to swallow entire fleets. These were not just artistic flourishes, they were calculated psychological warfare, designed to dissuade ambitious competitors from entering the most profitable waters. The message was clear: these riches were reserved for those who already knew the secret paths, and for anyone else, the price of discovery was a gruesome death. Traders returning from the East did not simply describe long journeys. They spoke of deserts haunted by demons that whispered men to their doom, and of oceans that literally boiled under the midday sun. Marco Polo's famous travelogue, a book that captivated Europe for centuries, was a masterclass in this kind of narrative inflation. He wrote of islands inhabited entirely by dog-headed people, and of valleys so deep they were perpetually shrouded in darkness. While some of his accounts were based on real observations, many were wild embellishments picked up from other merchants or invented to make his own journey seem more heroic and the goods he described more impossibly rare. Why would he do this? Because a story of a safe, straightforward trip to a bustling market is not a story that sells books or spices, but a tale of surviving monstrous beasts and supernatural perils makes the listener believe that the silk or the pepper in your hand is not just a product, it is a trophy earned through unimaginable bravery. This created a formidable barrier to entry. Only the most courageous, or perhaps the most desperate, would invest their lives and fortunes into a venture that was publicly described as a near-suicidal mission. This fear protected the established trade networks, allowing a small group of cartels to maintain their stranglehold on global commerce for generations. By inflating the risks, they were not just selling a product, they were selling a legend, and ensuring that their control over the truth remained as absolute as their control over the trade routes themselves. It makes you consider how often the perceived risk of a venture is just another carefully crafted story, designed to keep you from ever starting the journey. Beyond the tales of perilous journeys lay an even more potent economic weapon: the outright fabrication of scarcity. A merchant in a crowded medieval square might hold up a small vial of saffron, his voice trembling with feigned gravity as he announces this is the final harvest from a legendary garden destroyed by a freak frost. The bidding frenzy that follows is not based on reality, but on a carefully staged performance of rarity. This third great deception was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, where the value of a good was untethered from its actual abundance and tied instead to a compelling story of its imminent disappearance. Pharaohs in Egypt and emperors in Rome perfected this art, building vast underground treasuries to hoard mountains of gold, silver, and precious gems. They did not do this merely for security. It was a calculated market strategy. By physically removing these materials from circulation and then releasing them in tiny, controlled amounts, they created the unshakable illusion that such treasures were inherently and perpetually rare. Economic historians like Michael McCormack point to these practices as early forms of market bubbles, where the price of something was driven entirely by the perception of its scarcity, not its practical use. The most famous example is the legendary Tyrian purple dye. Sourced from a specific sea snail, its production was already limited by nature, but the merchants of Tyre did not leave it at that. They tightly controlled the number of snails harvested and, more importantly, wove elaborate myths about the dye's divine origins, claiming it was a gift from the gods reserved only for royalty. This fabricated narrative of exclusivity and extreme rarity transformed a colorful pigment into the ultimate symbol of status and power, a luxury so expensive that wearing it was effectively a public declaration of your immense wealth. These artificial scarcities did more than just maximize profits for a few clever traders. They became tools for reinforcing the entire social order, creating a visible divide between the elite who could afford the myth and the common people who could not. The value was never just in the object itself, but in the story of its impossible rarity, a story that ensured power and wealth remained in the hands of those who controlled the narrative. It forces a question we still grapple with today: how much of what we consider precious is truly rare, and how much of its value is just a story we have all agreed to believe? But perhaps the most brilliant deception involved selling not just rarity, but a piece of the divine itself. Alongside stories of perilous journeys and artificial scarcity, traders perfected the art of inventing magical properties for their wares. An ordinary stone could become a powerful amulet, a common root a cure for all diseases, and a simple aromatic resin a direct line to the gods. This was not mere marketing, it was a profound manipulation of human hope and fear. Ancient Greek and Roman texts are filled with such marvels. The legendary moly herb, described by Homer as a magical antidote to sorcery, was likely just a common plant whose identity was lost behind a veil of poetic license and trader-tall tales. Phoenix feathers, said to grant immortality, were almost certainly the brilliantly colored plumes of exotic but very real birds, their origin mythologized to multiply their value 1,000-fold. This deception worked because it tapped directly into the deepest cultural beliefs and anxieties of the buyer. If you could convince a person that a specific gem would protect their child from evil spirits, or that a certain spice could prolong their life, you were no longer selling a simple object. You were selling safety, health, and salvation. The price for such things, of course, could be limitless. Frankincense offers a perfect example. While it produced a pleasant scent when burned, its true, staggering value came from the story that its smoke carried prayers directly to the heavens, pleasing the gods and ensuring divine favor. This single, powerful narrative guaranteed its place in countless religious rituals across the ancient world, from the temples of Rome to the courts of Jerusalem, creating an unshakable demand that had nothing to do with its physical properties. By embedding their goods with this kind of mythical significance, merchants achieved the ultimate goal. They created a desire that transcended practical use, a demand that was immune to logic or price fluctuations. The object became a sacred symbol, and its value was cemented not in the market but in the human soul. It makes you wonder how many modern products we covet not for what they are, but for the invisible, almost magical qualities we have been convinced they possess. Beyond the grand myths of serpents and magic lay a more mundane, yet equally ruthless form of deception, one that played out in the dusty chaos of every local market. A merchant's hand might subtly tilt a scale, or a measuring vessel could secretly have a thick, hidden bottom. These were not stories of distant peril, but the quiet, physical lies of manipulated weights and measures. This fifth deception was a brutal, hands-on fraud that exploited the most basic vulnerability of trade, the difficulty of verifying quantity and purity in a world without universal standards. Archaeologists digging through ancient Mesopotamian cities often find carefully carved stone weights, bearing the seals of kings who tried to impose order on this chaos. These official standards were a declaration that a mina was a mina and a shekel was a shekel. Yet for every honest weight, there were countless others, cleverly designed with hollow cores that could be filled with lead or dust to make them heavier when weighing a customer's gold, or lighter when measuring out the merchant's own goods. This was a high-stakes shell game played with the very fundamentals of value. Economic thinkers like Deirdre McCloskey note that such frauds were a constant tax on trust, a silent drain on the economy that authorities struggled to contain. Think of the silk trade, where a buyer might pay for a bale of the finest fabric, only to discover later that the core was stuffed with cheap cotton or ragged cloth, the precious material only visible on the outside. Or consider the gold coin passed from hand to hand, its edges carefully shaved or clipped by each holder, slowly reducing its precious metal content until the coin was a pale, lightweight ghost of its official worth. These were not victimless crimes. A family might pay for a week's worth of grain, only to find the sack was 1/5 empty, a difference that could mean the difference between sustenance and starvation. The beauty of this deception for the fraudster was its subtlety and deniability. In a crowded, noisy marketplace, who could prove the scale was faulty? Without a reference weight in your own pocket, how could you challenge the measure? This physical trickery ensured that profit could be squeezed from every transaction, not through epic tales, but through a silent, confident cheat that relied on the simple, crushing weight of everyday doubt. While merchants were busy rigging their scales in the local markets, an even grander deception was unfolding on a global scale: the deliberate corruption of maps. Imagine a Venetian cartographer carefully inking a sea monster onto a vellum chart, not as a decoration, but as a warning to any rival who might try to follow his patron's route. This sixth great deception was the strategic spread of false geographic knowledge, a calculated campaign to mislead entire nations and protect the world's most lucrative secrets. The most respected sources were often the most compromised. The maps of Claudius Ptolemy, revered for centuries as the pinnacle of ancient geography, placed non-existent islands in the Indian Ocean and distorted the shape of continents. While some errors were honest, many historians now suspect these were intentional traps, seeded to send competing expeditions on fruitless, expensive voyages into empty seas. Medieval portolan charts, the indispensable navigation tools for European sailors, were masterpieces of this selective truth. They might accurately depict a familiar coastline, but then omit a crucial bay that served as a secret trading post, or insert a fictional mountain range to suggest a land route was impassable. These were not simple mistakes. They were the cartographic equivalent of a locked door, designed to protect the keys to immense wealth. Travelers' journals, like the widely read accounts of Sir John Mandeville, bolstered this false reality with vivid descriptions of lands where giants roamed and rivers ran with gold, further obscuring the true, and often more mundane, pathways to Asia. The spice trade depended entirely on this manufactured ignorance. For generations, European powers had no idea that pepper and cloves came from specific islands in the East Indies. They were told only that these treasures arrived from a vague, mystical East after a journey of unimaginable hardship. Arab and Indian merchants, the middlemen in this vast network, had every incentive to perpetuate this myth. They spun tales of a spice route guarded by supernatural forces, ensuring that European ships would continue to pay their inflated prices in Mediterranean ports rather than sailing directly to the source. By controlling the geographic narrative, a small group of traders could effectively redirect the course of history, delaying the age of exploration for decades and ensuring their own pockets remained full. The most valuable map was not the one that showed the truth, but the one that pointed your rivals in the wrong direction. This makes you question how much of our own understanding of the world is still shaped by convenient fictions designed to keep us from finding a better path. The most effective lies were not just about the goods themselves, but about who controlled the supply. A new kind of deception emerged, one that created entire fictional kingdoms and exclusive partnerships to build an aura of unassailable monopoly. The legend of Prester John stands as the ultimate example, a story of a wealthy Christian king ruling a paradise of gems and spices somewhere in the distant East. For centuries, this tale was not just a fantasy, it was a geopolitical tool. European monarchs and popes sent embassies to find him, hoping to secure a powerful ally against their enemies, and more importantly, to bypass the Muslim and Venetian middlemen who controlled the spice trade. The story created a phantom partnership, a justification for exploration, and a deterrent to any rival who might believe this legendary king's favor was already spoken for. Historians like Jerry Broughton have shown how these fabricated legends directly fueled the age of exploration, turning myth into a blueprint for conquest. The Portuguese took this a step further with their relentless pursuit of Solomon's mines. By claiming they were following ancient maps to the biblical king's legendary source of gold, they were not just telling a story, they were building a brand. This narrative of divine right and exclusive access was a masterstroke for attracting investors who would not want to fund a voyage blessed by biblical prophecy. And more crucially, what competitor would dare challenge a claim that seemed to have the backing of Scripture itself? This created a psychological monopoly long before a single ship ever landed. It was a brilliant bluff, convincing the entire market that your connection to the source was so privileged, so unique, that trying to compete was both futile and blasphemous. These fictional monopolies did more than just secure funding. They built entire empires on a foundation of persuasive fiction, proving that the most powerful trade barrier was not a wall or a navy, but a story everyone believed. Even the most convincing story of divine origin could be rendered worthless if the object itself was a clever fake. The eighth great deception was the art of forging authenticity, a practice as old as trade itself. A Roman nobleman might pay a fortune for a splinter of wood said to be from the true cross, a relic infused with immense spiritual power, only to have it be a piece of common pine carved in a backstreet workshop in Jerusalem. This was not just a lie about the item's properties, but a complete fabrication of its history, a deception that preyed upon the deepest human yearnings for connection to history, to faith, and to prestige. Artisans in ancient times honed their skills not only in creation but in deliberate aging. They learned to stain new pottery to look centuries old, to replicate the exact brushstrokes of a master from a distant land, and to inscribe false dedications on statues to link them to famous kings. When Chinese porcelain first reached Europe, its translucent beauty was so coveted that local potters worked tirelessly to imitate its composition and delicate designs, creating passable fakes that were sold at a fraction of the price, but with a fabricated story of an exotic journey. Archaeologists like Colin Renfrew have uncovered workshops across the ancient world dedicated entirely to this craft of deception. In Egypt, a tourist visiting a temple 2,000 years ago could buy a genuine-looking scarab amulet, beautifully carved and aged to appear ancient, assured it was a genuine artifact from a pharaoh's tomb. In reality, it was one of hundreds produced that very week in a nearby village, a mass-produced souvenir for the gullible traveler. The value of these objects was not in their material, but in the story of their provenance, their documented chain of ownership back to a moment of historical or religious significance. By inventing this lineage, traders transformed a simple stone into a sacred object and a new vase into a priceless antique. They were selling a piece of a story that the buyer desperately wanted to believe, capitalizing on the universal desire to own not just an object, but a fragment of legend itself. This deception asks a profound question about our own possessions. How much of their value comes from the object itself, and how much is tied to the authenticity of the story we tell ourselves about where they have been? A single mistranslated word could launch a fleet of ships on a fool's errand for gold that never existed. This ninth deception, the exploitation of cultural misunderstandings, turned the vast and complex tapestry of human difference into a deliberate tool for profit. Traders did not just navigate seas and deserts, they navigated the deep chasms between languages and customs, often finding it more profitable to widen those gaps than to bridge them. A European merchant observing an elaborate tea ceremony in China might completely misinterpret the ritual's spiritual significance, reporting back to his sponsors that the Chinese nobility used cups of incredible value in their daily worship. This was not a simple mistake, it was a fertile ground for invention. Traders would return home with wild tales, claiming that certain spices were not just flavorings, but essential components for foreign religious rites, or that specific silks were mandated by law for royal coronations in distant, unknowable kingdoms. The work of anthropologists like Claude Lévi-Strauss reveals how these cultural exchanges were rarely equal. Objects and practices were stripped of their original meaning and repackaged with a new, more marketable story for a foreign audience. The history of the Silk Road is filled with such creative reinterpretations. A common Central Asian fabric could be sold in Rome as the ceremonial garb of Eastern mystics, its price inflated not by its quality, but by the compelling and entirely fictional narrative of its sacred use. The most powerful example lies in the story of wampum, the polished shell beads used by Native American tribes. When Europeans first encountered wampum, they largely dismissed it as simple decoration. But as colonists sought to build economic systems and trade with the tribes, a few clever traders realized its deep cultural significance as a marker of agreements and a store of value within native societies. They did not simply adopt its use, they actively hyped it, transforming wampum in the eyes of other colonists from a trivial trinket into a rare and essential currency for all dealings with the indigenous population. This created a manufactured demand that twisted a traditional cultural object into a tool of colonial economics, fostering a dependency that served the traders' interests perfectly. By leveraging cultural ignorance, a merchant could create a market from thin air, convincing one culture that it desperately needed something it had never seen before, all based on a story about a world it would never truly understand. How many of our own desires are built on a similar foundation of crossed signals and repackaged truths, where the story of a product's meaning is more valuable than the product itself? The most valuable secrets were not whispered but signaled with a subtle flick of the wrist in a crowded port. While cultural misunderstandings created confusion, a 10th deception weaponized clarity itself through coded languages and secret symbols. In the dim light of a guild hall, a merchant might brush his fingers against his lapel, a silent signal to his partner that the official tax collector had just entered the market. Across a bale of silk, a series of seemingly random scratches near the hem told an initiated handler the true port of origin and the agreed-upon minimum price, information completely hidden from the paying customer. This system of covert communication was the lifeblood of ancient trade cartels, creating an impenetrable wall between those in the know and everyone else. The Phoenicians, masters of Mediterranean commerce, were famed for this. They coordinated their vast shipping networks using signals from hilltop fires and employed cipher-like markings on cargo manifests to obscure the nature of their goods from rival traders and port authorities alike. This was not just about avoiding competition. It was about evading the heavy taxes that kings and emperors levied on luxury items. By hiding the true value and contents of a shipment, a merchant could dramatically increase his profit margin. Historians working to decipher ancient scripts like Linear B, the early Greek writing system used by Mycenaean traders, have uncovered this practice on a grand scale. Their clay tablets recorded vast inventories of olive oil, wool, and pottery, but the entries were often written in a bureaucratic shorthand full of abbreviations and coded terms. To an outsider, it was a meaningless list. To a palace official, it was a simple accounting of goods. But to the merchants themselves, certain repeated symbols or unusual groupings could have indicated which items were of substandard quality, which were destined for a special, high-paying client, or which loads had already been tampered with to reduce their weight. A simple diamond shape carved into the base of a pottery amphora before firing might look like a potter's mark, but to a merchant across the sea, it instantly communicated that the jar contained the highest grade of olive oil, warranting a premium price. This deliberate information asymmetry was the ultimate advantage. A customer haggling over a piece of cloth had no idea the merchant knew a ship carrying a competing, cheaper shipment had just been lost in a storm. A rival trader could not undercut a price because he had no way of knowing the true cost the other merchant had paid at the source. By controlling the flow of information through their own private channels, these ancient networks functioned like modern corporations with insider knowledge, ensuring that the market always tilted in their favor. This silent language of commerce makes you question the unspoken signals that still govern our own markets today, and who might be reading the codes that we cannot even see. The silent codes of merchants were often amplified into epic public legends. An 11th Great Deception involved the outright fabrication of historical narratives, where the story of a journey was deliberately rewritten to transform a routine trade mission into a mythic quest. This was not just about hiding a route, it was about embedding a product's origin within a grand, heroic tale that justified any price. Travel writers became the perfect vehicles for this fraud. Figures like Sir John Manville published wildly popular books filled with first-hand accounts of lands where giants built cities and precious stones littered the ground like pebbles. His readers had no way of verifying these claims, and the sheer audacity of the stories lent them a strange credibility. The goal was not just to sell books, but to permanently alter the perception of the goods he described. If a spice came from an island guarded by monsters, then the merchant who sold it was not a simple businessman. He was a hero who had braved the impossible. This narrative alchemy directly inflated the value of his wares, making them symbols of adventure as much as objects of luxury. The most potent example is the legend of El Dorado, the Golden Man and his city of untold wealth. This story began with fragments of ritual and rumor from South America, but it was eagerly seized upon, embellished, and repeated by explorers and chroniclers until it became an undeniable truth in the European imagination. For centuries, this fabricated history drove countless expeditions, bankrupted kings, and cost thousands of lives, all in pursuit of a city that was nothing more than a compelling fiction. By crafting these false chronicles, traders and their storytellers did more than just enrich themselves. They created cultural obsessions that outlived them, proving that a well-told lie about the past could dictate the economic and exploratory endeavors of the future. It forces us to consider which of our own ambitions are fueled not by reality, but by the irresistible power of a story we have chosen to believe. A spice merchant burns his own ship's logbook, watching the parchment curl into black ash. This was not an act of rage, but of cold calculation. By destroying the only record of a successful voyage, he was protecting a secret more valuable than any single cargo, the knowledge of the route itself. This 12th deception was the deliberate hoarding and controlled release of information, a practice where the most powerful currency was not gold, but knowledge kept deliberately out of reach. Ancient merchant guilds and royal treasuries understood this principle perfectly. Their libraries and archives were not quiet halls of learning, but heavily guarded fortresses, their contents accessible only to a select few sworn to secrecy. Economic historians like Joel Mocker point to this systemic information hoarding as a primary reason why technological and commercial progress moved so slowly for centuries. If one group held a monopoly on a crucial piece of knowledge, they had no incentive to share it and every reason to guard it with their lives. The most famous example is China's stranglehold on silk. For nearly 2,000 years, the Chinese Empire successfully guarded the secret of sericulture, the complex process of raising silkworms and weaving their threads into fabric. Revealing the method was a crime punishable by death. This was not just about protecting a recipe, it was a form of economic warfare waged through silence. By controlling the information, China could set the price for silk at astronomical levels, creating a river of wealth that flowed directly into the imperial coffers for generations. This strategy of information control allowed traders to manipulate markets with precision. A merchant cartel, upon learning that a rival's ship had been lost, could choose to release a small amount of their stored goods at a premium, fabricating a story of a sudden, lucky find. Or they could withhold all goods entirely, driving prices to a fever pitch before flooding the market and reaping unimaginable profits. The power lay not in the spice or the silk, but in the exclusive knowledge of where it was, how much existed, and when it would arrive. In a world without instant communication, the man who controlled the flow of information held the power to shape reality itself for everyone else. How many of history's great fortunes were built not on what people knew, but on what they were carefully prevented from discovering? A merchant dips a simple iron nail into a bowl of water, then declares it has touched the true cross of Christ, instantly transforming it into a sacred relic worth a king's ransom. This 13th deception went beyond simple forgery. It was a masterful manipulation of faith itself. By weaving their goods directly into the fabric of religious and superstitious belief, traders created a market where the price was not measured in coin, but in the promise of salvation. The most powerful endorsement a product could have was not from a king, but from God. Historians such as Diarmaid MacCulloch have traced how this faith-based economy became one of the most lucrative industries of the medieval world. The trade in indulgences, pieces of parchment that promised to reduce a soul's time in purgatory, turned spiritual anxiety into a predictable revenue stream. Pilgrims traveling to holy sites were not just tourists, they were customers in a divine marketplace. In Jerusalem, they could purchase vials said to contain the very air Christ breathed, or small bags of soil from the hill of Calvary. These items had no intrinsic value, yet they commanded extraordinary prices because they offered a tangible connection to the divine, a piece of heaven on earth. This system relied on a powerful, often unspoken, partnership between merchants and clergy. A monk might authenticate a splinter of wood as a piece of Noah's Ark, and in return, the monastery received a share of the profits from the pilgrims who came to venerate it. Miracles were conveniently invented for specific products. An ordinary spring could be rebranded as holy water with healing properties after a merchant paid for a story of a vision to be circulated. By aligning their goods with these profound narratives, traders did more than just sell a product. They sold peace of mind, spiritual security, and a direct line to the afterlife. The value of a simple amulet or a vial of oil was no longer about what it was, but about the story of divine favor it represented, a story that made the faithful willing to pay any price. This blurring of piety and profit makes you wonder how many of our own modern purchases are driven by a similar, deeply emotional need to believe in something more than the object itself. While merchants crafted public legends, a shadow war was being waged in the back alleys of every major port. A well-dressed man from Venice might linger near the docks of Alexandria, his accent flawless as he casually questioned sailors about their cargo. He was not a fellow trader but a corporate spy, a living weapon in the 14th Great Deception. These double agents and covert operatives turned the flow of information into a battlefield where corporate secrets were the ultimate prize. Ancient empires were the true masters of this game. Rome and Carthage did not just fight with legions and warships, they waged economic warfare by infiltrating each other's trade networks. Their spies would report on the movement of grain fleets, the stockpiles of Spanish silver, and the prices being set in foreign markets, using this intelligence to manipulate supply and demand to their own advantage. The Han Dynasty in China took this to a new level of sophistication, sending undercover agents to live among the nomadic Xiongnu tribes. These operatives were not there for military reconnaissance alone. Their mission was to learn everything about the flow of goods along the emerging Silk Road, to understand which tribes controlled which oases, and to discover the hidden paths where tariffs could be avoided. This was industrial espionage on a continental scale, a deliberate effort to map the entire economic ecosystem of Central Asia from the inside. Centuries later, the Dutch East India Company perfected this model. They employed a small army of scouts and informants whose sole job was to track the Portuguese carracks carrying spices from the East Indies. These Dutch agents would note sailing times, chart hidden waterways, and even orchestrate sabotage, bribing local officials to delay their rivals' ships or spreading rumors of pirate activity along their routes. By turning intelligence into a weapon, these traders achieved something profound. They could anticipate market shifts, undercut competitors before their goods even arrived, and secure the best deals with local producers by knowing exactly what their rivals had paid. This constant, silent espionage ensured that market dominance was not just about who had the best goods, but about who knew the most secrets. It reveals a timeless truth about commerce, that sometimes the most valuable asset is not what you are selling, but what you know about the other guy. The most powerful cartels were born not in secret backrooms, but in plain sight, under the respectable banner of a merchant guild. 15th in our list of deceptions was the creation of artificial alliances, where supposed competitors met in private to fix the price of olive oil, ensuring every customer in the Mediterranean paid the same inflated rate. This was a conspiracy against the open market itself, a coordinated effort to strangle competition and guarantee profit through collusion rather than quality or efficiency. Historical records from ancient Athens detail official complaints about price fixing in the vital grain trade, with merchants forming pacts to withhold shipments until prices rose to an agreed-upon level. Those who broke ranks and sold for less faced not just social ostracism, but severe financial penalties from their so-called partners. Centuries later, the great economist Adam Smith would pinpoint the core problem with these arrangements, observing that people of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public. These alliances were a direct tax on every citizen, stifling the innovation and fair pricing that true competition encourages. The Hanseatic League stands as a monumental example. This confederation of German merchant guilds did not just facilitate trade across Northern Europe, it weaponized collective power. By controlling key port cities and trade routes, the League could impose brutal embargoes on any town or rival that refused to accept its terms, effectively locking out independent traders and forcing entire regions to pay whatever price the alliance demanded. They presented a united front of reliability and order, a public face that cleverly disguised their manipulative control over the supply of fur, timber, and wax. For the average person, this meant that the cost of a warm coat or a candle was not set by what it cost to make, but by what a small group of powerful men had decided you could afford to pay. These artificial alliances transformed the chaotic freedom of the marketplace into a carefully managed theater, where the illusion of choice masked a reality of controlled scarcity and fixed prices. It forces a question that echoes into our own time. How many of the prices we pay today are the result of genuine market forces, and how many are the quiet, enduring legacy of an agreement made centuries ago to keep them artificially high? A crate stamped with the seal of a famous Syrian vineyard promised a taste of distant, sun-drenched hills, but the wine inside was a sour local vintage, doctored with honey and herbs to mimic a prestige it never possessed. This 16th deception, the deliberate mislabeling and substitution of goods, was the fraud of the everyday, a quiet betrayal that turned the simple act of buying into a gamble. In the bustling markets of the ancient world, trust was the most fragile commodity of all. Archaeologists excavating the ruins of Pompeii have uncovered ceramic amphorae that once held garum, the prized fermented fish sauce. Chemical analysis of the residues inside reveals a shocking truth. Many were watered down or blended with cheaper fish, their labels still proudly declaring them to be the most expensive first-press grade. This was not an isolated incident. Experts like Andrew Wilson point to this as standard practice in markets where oversight was minimal and the opportunity for profit was too tempting to ignore. A merchant selling Chinese silk, for example, might expertly weave strands of cheap cotton into the core of the fabric, a substitution invisible to the eye but devastating to the value, allowing him to sell a partially fake product at the price of pure silk. In the gem trade, a buyer might pay a fortune for what was presented as a flawless emerald, only to later discover it was a piece of cleverly colored glass, its true nature revealed only by a jeweler's scratch or the warm touch of skin. This deception preyed on a fundamental gap in knowledge. The average Roman shopper could not chemically analyze their wine or perform a streak test on a gemstone. They had to rely on the merchant's word and the reputation of a stamp or a seal, both of which could be, and often were, forged. By exploiting this inherent information asymmetry, unscrupulous traders boosted their margins on every single transaction, eroding the very foundation of commerce, trust, one mislabeled crate and one fake gem at a time. It forces a sobering reflection on our own purchases. How often do we truly know what is inside the package, and how much are we still relying on a label that someone else designed for us to believe? Even the most rigid laws were no match for a well-placed bribe. A merchant slips a heavy purse of silver to a Roman port official, who then carefully looks the other way as a shipment of undeclared silk is unloaded under the cover of night. This 17th deception, the exploitation of legal loopholes and outright corruption, turned the rule of law into just another variable to be manipulated for profit. It was not enough to control the goods or the routes. The most successful traders learned to control the gatekeepers themselves. Ancient law codes, like the famous Code of Hammurabi, are filled with specific punishments for officials who accepted bribes and merchants who presented forged shipping manifests. The very fact that these laws were carved into stone for all to see is a testament to just how widespread and corrosive the practice had become. Historians like Michael Rostovtsev have documented how the Roman tax collection system was riddled with this kind of collusion. Tax farmers, the private contractors who collected duties for the state, frequently made secret deals with merchants. They would agree to assess a cargo of high-value amber or spices at a fraction of its true worth, splitting the tax savings between them and defrauding the imperial treasury of vast sums. This was a calculated risk with an enormous payoff. The amber trade from the Baltic to the Mediterranean offers a perfect case study. Traders would deliberately reroute their caravans through remote mountain passes or lesser-known riverways to avoid official toll stations staffed by the legions. If they could not avoid the checkpoint, they would simply lie, declaring a crate of priceless amber jewelry as a shipment of common resin or rough stone, thereby paying a minuscule duty on a fortune. This systemic corruption created a two-tiered system of commerce. Honest merchants who followed the rules were forced to charge higher prices to cover their taxes and fees, while their corrupt competitors could undercut them dramatically, all while pocketing even greater profits. By bending the rules, these traders were not just cheating the government, they were distorting the entire market, rewarding deception and punishing integrity. It forces a difficult question about the nature of power and profit. How many of history's great commercial empires were built not on innovation, but on a simple, silent agreement to look the other way? A Roman spice merchant might begin his day by setting an impossibly high anchor price for his pepper, a number so shocking it would make every subsequent offer seem reasonable by comparison. This 18th deception was a masterful application of psychological manipulation, turning the marketplace into a theater of the mind long before the term was ever coined. Ancient traders were intuitive psychologists, expertly wielding human biases and emotional triggers to guide customers toward a sale. They understood the principles that thinkers like Aristotle would later codify as rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking, and adapted them for pure profit. In the spice markets of Constantinople, this manipulation was a public spectacle. A seller would not simply name a price. He would stage an elaborate auction, using shills planted throughout the crowd to call out increasingly frantic bids. This manufactured social proof created a powerful illusion of scarcity and desirability, convincing genuine buyers that they were competing for a vanishing resource and that the value must be immense if so many others were willing to pay such sums. The fear of missing out, that sharp pang of anxiety at the thought of losing a precious opportunity, was their most potent tool. A merchant might lean in and confide that the frankincense he was holding was from the final harvest before a legendary grove was consumed by a sandstorm, a story designed to bypass rational calculation and trigger an immediate emotional purchase. By framing a choice not as a transaction, but as a unique chance for salvation, status, or security, these sellers could completely disconnect the price from any objective worth. They were not just selling a product, they were selling a feeling, and feelings have no set market value. This deep understanding of desire and fear allowed them to craft pitches that felt less like a sale and more like a favor, transforming a simple jar of saffron into a one-time opportunity for a lifetime of prestige. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about our own buying habits. How often is the urge to purchase something driven not by its utility, but by a cleverly crafted story that speaks directly to our deepest insecurities and aspirations? The price of a spice was not the only number a merchant could manipulate. Behind the public spectacle of the auction lay a quieter, more insidious fraud, the deliberate falsification of economic data. 19 in our list of deceptions was the art of creative bookkeeping, where the ink on a ledger told a story carefully designed to mislead kings, investors, and tax collectors alike. In the dim light of a counting house, a merchant's scribe might meticulously record the cost of a shipment of Syrian wine, but quietly add an extra 10% to the price, padding the expense column to explain away profits he wished to hide from his partners. Ancient cuneiform tablets recovered from Mesopotamian cities reveal this practice in stunning detail. One set of records might show a payment of 5 shekels of silver for a load of timber, while another tablet from the same transaction, perhaps an internal one, lists the true cost as only 4. These were not simple errors, they were calculated adjustments, a silent shell game played with numbers to serve whatever purpose was most convenient that day. Historians like Norman Davies have traced this pattern through the meticulously kept records of medieval European trade guilds, where the same shipment of Flemish wool might be valued at one price for attracting investors and a completely different, much lower price when it was time to pay royal import duties. The motive was always the same: to control the narrative of wealth. A merchant seeking backing for a risky voyage to the east would dramatically overstate the potential costs of ship repairs and crew wages, painting a picture of immense financial peril. This fabricated data made his eventual success seem all the more heroic and, more importantly, justified the enormous returns he would later claim, returns that his investors had no way of independently verifying. Conversely, when that same merchant ship returned to port laden with pepper and silk, the official cargo manifest presented to the harbor master would mysteriously underreport the quantity by a third, a simple lie that slashed his tax burden and preserved his hidden hoard of wealth. By controlling the numbers, these traders held a unique power. They could appear perpetually on the brink of ruin to one audience while secretly amassing a fortune, all documented in ledgers that looked impeccably honest. This manipulation of basic financial truth distorted entire economies, directing capital toward phantom risks and depriving states of revenue needed for public works. It forces a question that resonates in our own data-saturated world. If the numbers we base our decisions on can be so easily rewritten, how can we ever truly know the value of anything? A gift was never just a gift in the ancient marketplace. It was a snare, a carefully laid trap of obligation disguised as generosity. The 20th Great Deception involved creating dependency through strategic gifting, a practice where lavish presents served as the velvet glove around an iron fist of economic control. Envision a foreign envoy arriving at the court of a powerful local ruler, his caravan laden not with goods for sale, but with priceless treasures offered freely, silk so fine it felt like air, porcelain vases painted with mythical beasts, intricate clocks that chimed with the hours. This performance of generosity was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. By accepting these unsolicited gifts, the ruler was subtly maneuvered into a position of debt, creating a social and political obligation that almost always led to shockingly favorable trade terms for the giver. The Ming dynasty in China perfected this system on a global scale through their elaborate tribute system. Neighboring states were encouraged to send embassies to the Chinese emperor, bearing symbolic gifts that acknowledged his supremacy. In return, the Ming court would bestow upon them even greater quantities of silk, porcelain, and silver. This was not a simple exchange of pleasantries. It was a brilliant geopolitical strategy that framed Chinese economic dominance as magnanimous patronage, locking weaker states into a relationship of dependency where their political legitimacy was tied to accepting Beijing's terms of trade. Anthropologist Marcel Mauss explored this dynamic in his work on gift economies, revealing how the act of giving creates a powerful, unspoken demand for reciprocation. This cultural mechanism was ruthlessly exploited by European traders when they first reached the Americas. They offered brightly colored glass beads, simple metal mirrors, and cheap cloth to indigenous leaders, items that were novel and fascinating but of little intrinsic value. In the complex social codes of many native societies, accepting these gifts created a binding obligation to give something of equal worth in return. The traders, understanding this perfectly, gladly accepted vast tracts of land, exclusive hunting rights, and invaluable animal pelts in a lopsided exchange that masked sheer exploitation under the guise of friendship and mutual exchange. By disguising a raw commercial transaction as an act of gift-giving, these merchants fostered long-term reliance. The local population grew accustomed to, and often dependent upon, the continued flow of these new goods, securing a permanent market and a steady supply of resources for the traders for generations to come. It reveals a chilling truth about power, that sometimes the most effective way to control someone is not to take from them, but to give them something first, creating a debt that can never truly be repaid. A whisper in a crowded Roman port could be more devastating than a storm at sea. The 21st deception was a brutal form of financial sabotage, the deliberate spreading of rumors to destabilize entire markets for personal gain. While a merchant might lie about his own goods, this tactic involved inventing disasters for his rivals. A carefully placed rumor that a competitor's fleet had been lost in a monsoon, or that a key spice-growing region had been consumed by a sudden blight, could send shockwaves through the marketplace. Panic would set in, those holding stocks of the supposedly lost commodity, fearing a total loss, would begin a frantic sell-off, desperately dumping their goods at any price. And who would be waiting in the wings to buy up this suddenly cheap pepper or silk? The very merchant who had started the false story in the first place. The Roman historian Tacitus documented how the vital grain supply was constantly vulnerable to these engineered panics. A single, unverified report of a poor harvest in Egypt or a pirate blockade near Sicily could cause the price of bread to skyrocket overnight in Rome, creating riots in the streets and immense profits for the few who had hoarded grain beforehand. This was information warfare waged not with swords but with whispers. The spice trade was particularly susceptible to this manipulation. A cartel of merchants, sitting on a huge stockpile of pepper, could release a fabricated account of a miraculous bumper crop harvest in the Malabar Islands. The expectation of a future glut would cause current prices to plummet, allowing the cartel to quietly buy up even more pepper from panicked sellers at a fraction of its worth. Once they had consolidated their control, they would then reveal the truth or simply let the false rumor fade, watching as prices rebounded even higher than before. By manipulating public perception through nothing more than gossip and fabricated reports, these traders created a self-fulfilling prophecy. They manufactured the very volatility they needed to profit, turning the collective anxiety of the market into their own private gold mine. It reveals a chilling precursor to modern pump and dump schemes, proving that the most powerful force in any market is often not the reality of supply and demand, but the terrifying speed of a lie that everyone believes. A real crisis offered the perfect cover for a manufactured one. 22nd in our long history of trade deception was the cold-blooded exploitation of natural disasters and human suffering. When a famine gripped the land or an earthquake shattered a city, the most ruthless merchants saw not tragedy but opportunity. They would hoard essential goods like grain or timber, creating secret stockpiles while publicly lamenting the terrible scarcity. Then, as desperation set in, they would release their hoarded supplies at prices so inflated they were often beyond the reach of the very people whose lives depended on them. This was not merely price gouging, it was economic warfare waged against the vulnerable. Ancient Egyptian papyri record the grim reality following a failure of the Nile's annual flood. While pharaohs distributed grain from royal granaries to prevent unrest, private traders would buy up every available sack in surrounding regions. They would then transport it to the starving areas, selling it for 10 or 20 times its normal price, their profit fueled by the absolute desperation of their customers. Historian Mike Davis, in his work on late Victorian famines, exposed how this practice was systematized by colonial powers. British authorities in India, for instance, continued to export vast quantities of grain out of famine-stricken regions to meet commercial obligations, deliberately worsening the crisis to break local economies and force dependency on imperial trade networks. The deception was layered. A merchant might claim that the roads were impassable due to floods, that bandits had stolen a shipment, or that a plague had wiped out the workforce, all to justify his extortionate prices. After a devastating earthquake, builders and lumber merchants would often form a quick, silent cartel, suddenly claiming that the very stones and beams they had in their yards were now the last available for 100 miles. They presented themselves not as predators, but as the only lifeline in a shattered world, their exploitation disguised as a vital service. By leveraging real catastrophes, these traders performed a terrible magic, transforming human misery directly into personal wealth and ensuring that recovery came at a cost that would enslave generations to debt. It forces a difficult look at our own times, at how easily a real emergency can be used to reshape an economy, and who truly profits when the world seems to be falling apart. A master glassblower in Alexandria might spend a lifetime perfecting a formula for perfectly clear glass, only to shatter his own tools before his death to ensure the secret died with him. This 23rd deception transformed technological innovation into a weapon of market control. It was not enough to know a trade route or spin a good story. The most powerful merchants guarded the very methods of production, treating revolutionary knowledge as their ultimate proprietary asset. The Chinese Empire's monopoly on papermaking stands as a monumental example. For over 500 years, they successfully kept the complex process of turning mulberry bark and hemp into smooth, durable paper a state secret. This was not merely a cultural preference, it was a calculated economic strategy. By controlling the technology, China could dictate the terms of a product essential for administration, literature, and commerce, forcing the entire known world to come to them for this indispensable material. Historians like Joseph Needham documented how this systematic hoarding of technical knowledge, while beneficial for a single nation, dramatically slowed the pace of global progress. Consider the astrolabe, the intricate brass instrument that allowed sailors to navigate by the stars. When it was first developed, its use and construction were closely guarded secrets among Arab astronomers and traders. This gave them an insurmountable advantage in plotting courses across the open ocean, securing their dominance over the Indian Ocean trade routes for generations. European sailors, lacking this precise technology, were forced to cling to coastlines, their voyages slower, more dangerous, and far less profitable. By locking away the blueprints for progress, a single group could delay the dawn of new ages, ensuring that their own dominance remained unchallenged. This practice raises a profound question about the nature of innovation itself. Is a breakthrough truly valuable if its benefits are hoarded by a few, or does its real power only emerge when it becomes a tool for everyone? A Monochanga's table in ancient Athens was a stage for a quiet, ruthless kind of theft. He would gladly accept worn, faded coins for the goods he sold, but when it came time to repay a debt or make change, he would insist on only the newest, heaviest, most pristine coins fresh from the mint. This 24th deception was a masterclass in financial manipulation, where the value of money itself became a variable to be twisted for profit. The most powerful method was the outright debasement of currency. Roman emperors, desperate to fund endless wars and colossal building projects, would secretly order the imperial mints to reduce the silver content in their denarius coins, mixing in cheaper copper or lead. They could then produce more coins from the same silver reserve, paying their armies and settling debts with currency that was intrinsically worth less. But the traders were always one step ahead. Numismatists like David Sear have studied thousands of these ancient coins, revealing the telltale signs of this fraud. Coins that were expertly clipped around the edges to shave off precious metal, or ones with a core of base metal plated with a thin veneer of silver. These traders were not just victims of imperial inflation, they were active participants. A merchant selling Chinese silk to a Roman buyer might insist on payment not in Roman denarii, but in a specific Greek or Persian currency that he and his partners largely controlled. Through coordinated buying and selling, they could artificially inflate the value of that foreign coin just long enough to complete their high-value transaction, effectively forcing the buyer to pay a hidden premium. In the bustling ports of the Mediterranean, exchange rate fluctuations were a weapon. A trader might agree to a price in Egyptian deben, knowing full well that a ship laden with silver was due to arrive next week, an event that would dramatically shift the relative value of the metals and leave his counterparty holding the weaker currency. By manipulating the very medium of exchange, these financiers embedded deception into the foundation of every transaction, stealing value not through force, but through a silent, confident understanding that most people never look beyond the face of the coin. It forces a question about our own digital transactions. How much of the value we see on a screen is real, and how much is just another carefully managed consensus? A royal decree could transform a warehouse of unwanted purple cloth into the most coveted treasure in the kingdom. The 25th deception was the deliberate engineering of desire itself, where merchants learned to manufacture trends and status symbols to guarantee a market for their goods. This was not about responding to demand, but about creating it from nothing, using the powerful human urge for social standing as their lever. The Tudor sumptuary laws in England were a perfect vehicle for this. These laws legally restricted the wearing of certain luxurious fabrics, like specific shades of scarlet or cloth of gold, to the royal family and the highest ranks of the nobility. While presented as a way to maintain social order, these laws functioned as a brilliant marketing campaign. By making a fabric illegal for commoners, the law instantly and dramatically increased its perceived prestige. A merchant with a large stock of crimson silk, now officially reserved for earls and dukes, could charge a fortune to any ambitious nobleman desperate to display his place in the elite. This was artificial scarcity codified into law, a conspiracy of taste between the crown and commerce. Centuries later, the sociologist Thorstein Veblen would give this phenomenon a name: conspicuous consumption, the practice of buying expensive goods not for their utility, but to publicly display wealth and status. Nothing illustrates this better than the tulip mania that gripped the Dutch Republic in the 1600s. Initially, these exotic flowers were simply beautiful, but a targeted campaign by growers and speculators transformed them into the ultimate status symbol. They circulated stories of unique, broken patterns in the petals being incredibly rare, and they hosted lavish parties where the most expensive bulbs were the centerpiece. They created a cultural frenzy, a collective belief that owning a certain tulip bulb was a direct reflection of one's sophistication and wealth. This manufactured desire detached the price of a tulip bulb completely from any rational value, leading to a speculative bubble where single bulbs were traded for the price of grand houses. By shaping the very definition of what was fashionable and desirable, traders ensured a constant, hungry market. They were not just selling a product, they were selling a membership to an exclusive club, and the price of admission was whatever they decided it should be. How many of the things we feel we must own are truly born of our own taste, and how many are the quiet, enduring echoes of a trend engineered for profit centuries ago? A royal seal on a parchment could be more powerful than an army. The 26th and final great deception was the art of forging the very documents that governed nations. creating a phantom legality to secure unimaginable trade advantages. Imagine a confident merchant in a foreign port unrolling a scroll before the local governor. The document, covered in elaborate script and bearing what appeared to be the official seal of the governor's own king, granted this merchant exclusive rights to all spice trade in the region for the next 10 years. The governor, with no fast way to verify the order from a court weeks away, would have little choice but to comply, effectively handing a monopoly to a complete stranger based on a brilliantly executed lie. Ancient archives are filled with these counterfeit treaties and falsified decrees, often used to win trade disputes or avoid paying heavy royal tariffs. Historians like Anthony Grafton have meticulously traced the history of such forgeries, showing how they were not the work of amateurs, but required deep knowledge of official language, seals, and diplomatic protocols. During the Age of Exploration, this practice became a tool for empire building. Competing European powers would often arrive in the same newly discovered land, and the first to plant a flag and present a charter claiming sovereignty could legally exclude all others. Some of these charters were entirely fabricated after the fact, backdated and filled with fictional accounts of discovery to legitimize a land grab and secure access to resources like gold, timber, or fertile soil. By leveraging the trusted authority of the written word, these traders and explorers operated with a cloak of impunity, using bureaucratic deception to outmaneuver rivals who played by the rules. They understood that a well-forged document could rewrite reality itself, turning theft into a legal right and exclusion into official policy. This final deception brings our journey to a close, revealing a system built not on sand, but on paper, where the most valuable commodity was often a convincing lie stamped with a fake seal. It forces a final, unsettling reflection on the foundations of our own world, where the power of a signature or a line in a contract can still shape destinies, and the truth of a document is only as strong as our ability to verify it. These 26 deceptions reveal a world where commerce was built not on truth, but on a foundation of brilliantly crafted lies. Each strategy, from the whispered myth of pepper guarding serpents to the forged royal charter, served a single, ruthless purpose: to control the market by controlling the narrative. This was not random fraud, but a sophisticated system where deception was the engine of profit, inflating prices, creating artificial scarcity, and ensuring that power remained firmly in the hands of those who controlled the story. The ancient merchant understood something we are still grappling with today, that perception is often more valuable than reality. The philosopher Seneca captured the moral weight of this system perfectly when he observed that a great fortune is a great slavery. The relentless pursuit of wealth through such means created its own prison, binding societies to cycles of exploitation and deceit. The echoes of these ancient tricks are all around us in the modern economy. The fabricated scarcity of limited edition products, the psychological manipulation of digital marketplaces, and even the spread of misinformation to influence stock prices are all direct descendants of the deceptions we have explored. This long history of commercial lies challenges you to look more critically at the world you participate in every day. What perceived truths about value, rarity, or quality do you accept without question? The stories wrapped around the products we buy and the investments we make are often the most carefully crafted part of their appeal. If this journey into the hidden architecture of ancient trade has changed your perspective, consider subscribing for more explorations into the layers of history that shape our present. We would love to hear which of these 26 deceptions surprised you the most. Share your thoughts in the comments